Many Trapani residents had taken refuge in the small mountain village. Now on a cool evening, they came out of the buildings with children of all ages to get some air, and the narrow paths were bustling with activity. People were standing in groups, talking and gesticulating. But it was not as it usually happened. They were more or less used to warfare in the air and were quickly returning to their normal activities, despite the constant threat of raids. Now, however, their conversations reflected the growing tension, and their faces were clearly marked by anxiety. They sensed that a change was coming, a transition to a new state of affairs, and the coming days in which it would happen were full of menace. The fate of their buildings, their villages, and in fact the whole island had reached a turning point. Their city was about to become a battlefield. Would the victors prove humane? Would there finally be peace and quiet? Rumours spread rapidly among these fickle people, always ready to believe the most incredible thing if it was convincingly enough presented to them. As we walked down the lane, the talk died down. Some looked at us hostilely, others turned their backs, but mostly there was an impassive fatalism on their face. The house in which the commander of the Italian group had set up his headquarters was on the edge of a small park with the ruins of a mountain castle. The air inside was refreshingly cool as the thick walls of the lobby kept the heat from penetrating. The colourful tiles on the floor and valuable tapestries made everyone feel as if they had entered a palace. Through the glass doors at the far end of the hall was a magnificent view of the bay lying at the foot of the mountain. The colonel met us in the drawing room. He was a man burdened by the enormous weight of his own body. When did he, I asked myself, last keep his hands on the helm? He sniffled and breathed heavily, showering us with a torrent of compliments and meaningless accolades. Without giving us time to respond, he clapped his hands together in Oriental style and ordered a waiter who appeared in the doorway to serve coffee in the dining room. Then he led me to the window and, spreading out his arms, shouted with enthusiasm. "Isn't the view magnificent?" In this I could agree with him. As we sat down at the low table, I felt some sympathy for the man. He looked at me pleadingly from time to time, as if hoping that things would change for the better as a result of my visit. He informed me that he had recently spoken to the headquarters of his army corps at Corleone, personally to the general, to whom he had told of the bravery of the fighter pilots in the face of superior enemy forces. But he also complained that he and his group had been neglected because no one had informed him of the situation or warned him of the enemy's approach. His telephone. Here he pointed to an ancient Italian field phone in a wooden box on a map-covered table. Was the only link to his army corps and higher command. The radio station designed to keep in contact with his Air Force command was old and virtually useless. It took a whole day to confirm a radiogram, so his information was always 24 hours out of date. Major Visconti, he continued, an excellent man. A really excellent man persuaded him to ask for our help. Visconti was desperate, endlessly watching German fighters take off in time or leave their aerodromes in time for the bombers to appear. What means did we use? The colonel wanted to know, to detect the approach of the enemy. He spoke as if he assumed we possessed supernatural secrets. He then asked if we were prepared to include the group in Tunisia in our communications system. He then began blowing frantically into the receiver of the telephone to demonstrate to us how he communicated with the command. He had no luck, as there was indeed no communication. Apparently the line had been cut again. After several minutes of fruitless endeavour, he desperately raised his eyes to the heavens and obediently hung up the receiver. I promised him my immediate assistance and offered to link Visconti's command post with mine in order that his group might receive timely reports not only from our radio interception unit on Mount Eris, but also from the direction finders near Marsala. Of course, this arrangement should have been reached weeks earlier, but we were too busy rebuilding the squadron after the defeat in Tunisia to take into account the concerns of our Italian allies. In turn, the Italians may have been too proud to ask for help. It occurred to me that they were, somehow, still living the realities of the First World War. Meeting the colonel confirmed my impression that the Italian commanders had failed to fully understand the technical aspects of that war. because they were too old and no longer mentally or physically capable of acting. I tried to interject to the colonel that although we would take steps to get things done, it would be of little use since the enemy was already on the island and our aerodromes were virtually destroyed, hence little or no use in planning for general action in the air. At this point in the conversation, I was ready to tell him that we were preparing to leave the island, and that two of us, the Hopman and myself, had spent the whole of the afternoon in preparing for the evacuation of the most important part of my squadron, its men. Something, however, prevented me from telling him the truth. He still had communication with the headquarters of his army corps, and in this respect was in a better position than I was. Somebody might have informed him whether he could leave his post, or notified him that he must surrender to the Americans. However, he seemed little inclined to make realistic predictions about the immediate future. He quickly turned his attention to other matters and began to discuss them animatedly, suddenly becoming thoughtful or almost cheerful. Changes of mood which, in view of the situation, seemed to me almost strange. Soon afterwards we left the colonel, who again expressed his gratitude fervently. In the advancing dusk we walked along the road to the fort, talking of our depressing impression and of poor old Visconti. I think the colonel will calm down a little now, I said. He seemed rather upset, and it was not easy for him to ask patronage from us Germans, but we should not boast of our superiority. We're not so marvellous anymore. We'd better help the Visconti before it's too late. High antennas rose above the castle tower. Our radio interception department set up its equipment in tents near the tower and listened to enemy radio messages transmitted by voice and Morse code. By being in direct contact with these specialists and their assessments, my squadron received timely information on matters that most concerned us. Field Fleeman Henrich, who commanded the radio interception section, was born in Canada and English was his mother's language. He and I were closely bound together by ties of mutual trust. "How is it going with our friends?" I asked. "So intense is the communications work, Mr. Major, that there is barely enough time to deal with it, and the tension is growing all the time. It seems that more and more units are rushing into our area. Listen to the noise! British, Americans, Canadians, Fighter bombers from Pantelleria, Spitfires from Malta. They're all on the air. Able 3, this is Baker 1, came through loud and clear. As background, I could hear another Englishman calmly checking his equipment. 1, 2, 3, 4, can you hear me? Our old friends, the Marauders again, Mr. Major, he said. Remember the group that was so inattentive at La Faconnerie? It was an incident I preferred not to recall. At that time, having just taken over the squadron, I was endeavouring to earn the respect of the pilots as quickly as possible. I regarded the incident in question as an obstacle to that end. We had just returned from a sortie, my second in Africa, and I was far from satisfied with the actions of everyone, including myself, and the way things were going. The manner in which the pilots of my new squadron acted in the air was different from that to which I had been accustomed in Russia. They were by no means timid or cowardly, but they failed to react quickly when I, realizing that we were in an advantageous position, tried to take advantage of it. At first they suspiciously scanned the air in all directions, knowing from experience that Spitfires usually come from where they are least expected. I blew the attack, lost control of the squadron, and was totally out of sorts when I returned to the aerodrome. As I was climbing into the staff car standing on the edge of the landing pad, the duty officer reported to me that Henrich wanted to speak to me. The field Feldbell reported that the Marauders had flown from Tebessa as usual and were going to bomb La Faconnerie, a conclusion he had drawn from their radio conversations. Without further ado, I got into the Kuba-wagon, saying, "I'm not going to stay here and play the hero. I'm moving to the olive grove," and with that I departed. In a shady plantation of palm and olive trees were set up the tents of the squadron headquarters. There also stood a van, which I had inherited from my predecessor, in which Straden, Bachmann, and myself were in the habit of sleeping. There was also a large piano in the grove, standing directly on the sand, with which Lieutenant Merkel used to entertain us every evening. The plantation was 2 kilometers from the aerodrome or a little further, and I was in no hurry. The hum of approaching aircraft engines made me stop not far from the van. At the same moment I heard the whistle of falling bombs and barely had time to jump into an irrigation ditch deep enough to protect me. In this position I enjoyed the dubious pleasure of playing hero under a downpour of small, high-explosive bombs. When at last I was able to get up, I saw the cubicle where I had left it. The tires were punctured, but the engine was still running. Our tents, however, presented a pitiful sight. Shrapnel had penetrated the tarpaulin. Cots and luggage, water was gushing from the punctured jerry cans. The van was miraculously unharmed, but the piano's career as a musical instrument was over, its strings a ball of twisted wire. When I returned to the staff car near the aerodrome, I was greeted with chuckles and obvious amusement. "There's nothing funny," I exclaimed. "They've just tried to bomb you, and you fall flat on your face into a shallow ditch that barely covers your arse." Right after you went to the Grove, Herr Major Henrich called again. We recorded what he intercepted. The officer on duty handed me a slip of paper on which I read. "This is the lead. This is the lead. Our objective is a small grove north of the aerodrome, where headquarters is probably stationed," said. As we drove down the mountainside on the narrow, white gravel road, it began to get dark. It was a time of deceptive calm, when the daylight raids had ended and the night raids had not yet begun. War or no war, it was the best time of day in Sicily, though the picture at sunrise was sometimes even more beautiful. Buchman stood on the threshold of the command post. He reported to me that Godert and Kohler had already landed and would arrive in a few minutes. The squadron had lost 4 pilots that day, including a lieutenant who had crashed during our attack on an enemy column near Gela. The third group, as ordered, flew to Sardinia. In the Cuba wagon arrived Godert and his squadron commander Kohler. They squeezed their eyes shut as they entered the brightly lit barracks, where they immediately began dictating their combat report. While Kegel, Tarnow and I discussed the final details of the withdrawal, Buchman joined Godert and Kohler with an empty bottle of dark, strong masala. After a while he turned to me and asked, "Would you like some wine, Herr Major?" I nodded, took the proffered bottle and took a large sip. It was this minor gesture that eased the tension we were all suffering from and could only shake off for a short time. "A pre-dinner aperitif," Godert joked as he watched me drink. Buchman grinned mirthlessly. "It seems to me that this will be our last meal in this private hotel," he said, and as an idea suddenly struck him, he continued. "Why not have a festive dinner at the villa instead of sitting in that gloomy old grotto?" "What about the Wellingtons?" Kohler asked. "Go to hell with them. The house is still standing. Why should it be struck just today?" Turning to me, Buchman say, "Why don't we invite these 2 prisoners, Herr Major? Considering that they are lucky to be alive, they might as well celebrate." "Very well," I agreed. "Ask them. It's kind of funny. Anyway, I have a feeling we'll be switching places with them soon. It'll give Fatty a chance to show what he can do. Either way, he won't have to carry his whole stockpile of treats with him. This time we'll have a party." Buchman was enthusiastically blowing into his phone to make arrangements for a celebratory dinner. Despite all the horrors these men had experienced in the war, their souls were so youthfully seething that their emotions couldn't help but burst forth. I asked about the prisoners. "We don't know whether they are English or Canadian. They are being interrogated now through an interpreter, but both are silent." An hour later, entering my room at the villa, I saw Fatty preparing a bowl of water for me. Supply has stopped again," he said. It would have been amazing if the electricity and water supply had been maintained throughout the past weeks of bombing. Walking into the living room, I found that Fatty had indeed performed a miracle. Between the balcony and the wall with the oval mirror, he had set up a long table. It was covered with a white tablecloth, and on it were paraded plates, cutlery, and shot glasses. There were 2 candlesticks with thin candles whose light was reflected in an oval mirror, and a bougainvillea bouquet, in a vase adorned the centre of the table. When I entered, all those seated stood up, thus beginning our dinner in a truly ceremonial style. Around the table were Goethe, Kohler, Dr. Sperling, Kester, Kegel, and Zoll. At the same moment another door opened and Bachmann, who spoke schoolboy English, politely ushered the two prisoners in. The Germans and British stood looking at each other. Perhaps they thought, quite mistakenly, of course, that we stood up to do them honour. The Canadian was thin, almost lanky but well-built, with an open, pleasant face. His flight lieutenant's uniform, consisting of faded khaki trousers and a shirt with sleeves rolled up, was clean enough. In contrast, the English sergeant was a small, fat man with a freckled face and short-cropped red hair. His uniform shorts looked too baggy for our taste, and he also wore knee-length gaiters. We sat them next to each other, but each of them acted as if the other didn't exist. We could not tell whether it was the difference in their ranks, or the fact that one was a Canadian and the other an Englishman, but both looked at us suspiciously. Heaven alone knows what stories they had been told of us Huns. Now they found, perhaps to their surprise, that the enemy was made of exactly the same material as any other man. The menu devised by Fatty was grand. Its advantage was not so much in culinary delights as in variety. It included 2 large plates of scrambled eggs mixed with Italian tinned meat, nicknamed Old Man because it had the letters imprinted on its. In addition, there were platters and plates of tuna, tinned sardines and anchovies, liver sausage, tinned ham, Italian savalet, and tomatoes. Despite our fatigue, we enjoyed our food and, while we ate, talked a little. The POWs answered our questions politely but succinctly and shut up the moment any military topic was broached. They also enjoyed this unexpected banquet. A good deal was drunk that night. As soon as anyone's shot glass was empty, Fatty would immediately fill it again. "Hey, Raz, drink now, or we'll have to pour it out when we leave," he said, backing up his words with action. But suddenly Beckman remarked, "We have lost the Storch, Herr Major." I wondered how long he had pondered before mustering the courage to give me the bad news. He had been taken out of action by Field Flieben Schultz. He was doing his duty at the command post when he suddenly saw 2 parachutes floating down. Storch was on the small airstrip, and he took off to collect the prisoners. One of them, a flying lieutenant, went down on the slope of the Eris. Schultz thought he had found a suitable field, but it was too steep. He lost the horizon, went to a critical angle of attack and crashed. What was I supposed to say? One might have exclaimed amateur, or rabbit, or some people will never learn, but now it really didn't seem to matter. There had been so many casualties. One Storch more, one less, but Bachmann did not share this opinion. "We certainly could have used it successfully," he said. "But why isn't anyone going to give us the order to withdraw? Then we won't need the Storch. And we won't be sent as infantry to the Eastern Front either." This was the first sharp remark made since the arrival of the notorious telegram. Everyone was aware of its contents, although no one had read it out officially. No one, however, reacted to this rejoinder. Apart from the fact that there was no point in venting our anger again, the presence of the prisoners made such a conversation impossible. They behaved very correctly and, hiding their embarrassment, ate a lot because they were very hungry. When at last everyone had eaten, Fatty began to clear the table while we continued to drink and smoke. We were all exhausted after a day of futile fighting, when, having achieved virtually nothing, we had lost 4 pilots. Everyone was waiting in their hearts for the order that would allow us to pull back if it wasn't too late and would determine our fate. I don't remember how Stalingrad suddenly came up as an object of discussion. Perhaps because someone's Sicily is Stalingrad in the south or something like that. At any rate, I started talking about Stalingrad. The conversation subsided and everyone, including the 2 prisoners, began to listen attentively, although it was not clear whether the latter could understand me. As long as it was possible to land, I told them, the range of our Messerschmitts allowed, I continued to shuttle back and forth between our forward airfields and the cauldron on the Volga. Going to land on small patches in the steppe was always a great challenge. These improvised runways were often under fire from Russian guns and multiple rocket launchers, Stalin's organs. One of our nightmares was the prospect of being left without an aircraft to be shot at by the enemy and burned up. The infantrymen were used to their ground role. They were organized into platoons and companies. They had learned how to fight such battles, and ground warfare was their element. We pilots, however, were helpless when deprived of our aeroplanes and left defenseless on the ground. Our combat value was negligible. We were incapable of correctly assessing danger. We bowed respectfully to every passing shell. In short, we did everything wrong. Whenever possible, therefore, I avoided visiting small landing grounds that were within range of Russian artillery. During the flights to Stalingrad, we were accustomed to keep low over the Rodor, rather over the track across the steppe on which our troops were advancing, and the infantrymen, whenever they saw us, were overjoyed and waved frantically at us. It was summer then, and the forward tanks were kicking up great clouds of dust in the air. Later we began to support the battle for the city, escorting Stukas and Ni-111 bombers. Never before had we hunted so well as we did then. As the Russians threw all the fighters they possessed to protect their troops from the fearsome Stukas. We celebrated victory after victory on our keels and were extremely pleased with ourselves. Soon the nature of our operations changed. Instead of bombers and Stukas, we were now escorting transport aircraft, which had to travel long distances over enemy territory to reach their destination. The encircled army organized airfields in the cauldron to receive equipment. On the eastern front, it was not unusual for a large formation to be surrounded by the enemy, and no one seemed overly concerned about it. This included us, although we could, however, see the development of the situation as a whole by calculating daily on our maps the number of kilometers to be flown. An alarming aspect was the ever-increasing distance between our front line and the Stalingrad cauldron. We spent more and more time escorting the old transport junkers, a job which acted oppressively on us. The losses of the junkers were even heavier than they had been here in the Mediterranean before we capitulated in Tunisia. Heavily laden junkers could not climb above 3,000 meters, the ideal altitude for medium-caliber anti-aircraft guns, of which the Russians had whole brigades. Any deviation from the course was not allowed primarily by the short range of our fighters, as well as the ever-widening gap between the take-off points of junkers and the runway nursery west of Stalingrad. Consequently, they had to follow a veritable alley of anti-aircraft fire for the duration of their flight over enemy territory. We were certainly capable of cutting off the Russian fighters, but could do nothing to protect our charges from fire from the ground. When the first snow began to fall, we relocated to the steppes of Kalmykia to take part in the attempted breakthrough to Stalingrad. Now it was a long way to Pitomnik, and we could no longer escort the junkers Heinkels and Dorniers, which had to fly their own roundabouts under the cover of night. Every time I flew over the dried-up ravines near Stalingrad, I could see the grey overcoats of German soldiers who had accumulated in those perishing places by the thousands. Many of my entourage saw the impending disaster, especially when winter came and the army was left without defence against the icy snowstorms. It was easy to see that ammunition and equipment stocks were melting, but how could they contradict the Reichsmarshal's statement? The Luftwaffe, my Führer, will take responsibility for supplying the 6th Army at Stalingrad. The pilot could watch the battle unfold in every stage of its development as if he were in a sandbox for a training exercise. Every morning, when he performed his first sortie over the area, he saw the changes that had taken place on the front and could assess what the ground troops could or could not do, what their prospects were for attack or defence. Through years of experience on various fronts, he was acquiring a trained eye. We knew more than the men on the ground about the vast distances over which we were operating, perhaps because we imagined the actual dimensions of them, which we had to calculate on a daily basis. One day we realized that we were being swallowed up by the boundless space of this steppe. We would arrive at some point in space, at a place without a name, where our junkers would take our mechanics and from where they would take off again to return with barrels of fuel. And this place became an advanced take-off and landing site and acquired a name. Giant, for example, or Gumrak, or something completely unpronounceable. I'm stone cold sober. Goddard muttered sadly, tipping the shot glass with his right elbow, which left a large puddle of red wine on the table, which gradually began to soak into the tablecloth. Betchman, the prisoners had better go back, I said, and bade them goodbye with a nod, to which they responded with a smile. Come on, boys, said Buckman, leading the two men to the door, where they paused for a moment to say good night. The room was filled with the smoke of cigarettes. We sat on wicker sofas and chairs, with our shirts unbuttoned across our chests and sleeves rolled up, wiping the sweat from our faces with the back of our palms. Every now and then a bottle gurgled, filling our shot glasses. Through the closed shutters we could hear the rumble of the Wellington's engines and, at irregular intervals, the muffled rips. No one paid any attention to the untargeted bombing. The probability that a bomb would have hit the villa was so negligible as to seem absurd. We became unusually indifferent to everything, taking little interest, for example, in what was happening back home. Here events followed each other so quickly that no one had time to think about them, and one day could seem the length of a year. Who could dare to think about tomorrow and make plans for the future? We were used to the empty rhythm of war and lived only until the next sortie. The evening sorties, or at most the next morning. What the next day might bring was completely indifferent to us. The time between the present and the future seemed an eternity. We were also accustomed to Freitag and his manner of leadership that his absence made us despondent. We did not wonder if he was still alive. Had he managed to keep his freedom after landing by parachute, or had he fallen straight into American hands? We speculated endlessly about this, but I felt there was little hope. During such evenings, Bachman and Straden were inseparable. They invariably had much to say to each other in the course of their whispered conversations, and thus contributed little to the general conversation. There was Freitag, who set the tone. Now Straden had also left us. He had been wounded and evacuated. Bachman retreated to a corner and sat there silently with his eyes downcast. It looked as if he was trying to create a distance between himself and us, wanted to be alone at least this evening. The conversation was virtually monopolized by Kohler. His tone was sarcastic and harsh, and Goddard, seated near him, accentuated his companion's wild remarks with expressive nods. He looked ill, and his eyelids were flushed with alcohol or perhaps fatigue. From time to time Kohler burst into hysterical laughter. We are despised, boys. Aren't you bursting out laughing? Despised by all the other fighters. Goddard is despised. Do you hear that, Goddard? They despise you. And Freitag too, if he's still alive. If he's dead, of course, he's a hero, a despised hero. The only good fighter pilot is a dead fighter pilot. Suddenly Bachman exploded. Shut up, we snapped, and don't have any more conversations like that. Being demoted and sent to the Eastern Front as a regular infantry unit is the best we can expect. If, of course, they leave us together. You don't know the main thing, Carla replied sharply. You don't know what they do with cowards. They send them to the disciplinary battalion with the rest of your good little ones, hastily accused men, deserters, defeatists. They also send the real criminals there to use them in some way. And the sectors they shove you into are always really deadly. In fact, the only difference is that instead of resting on your arse in the pilot's chair, you're lying in the muck with your short-barreled shotgun. It was time to put an end to this conversation. In a deliberately loud and official tone, I asked, Mupman Kegel, what are our orders for tomorrow? Kegel immediately understood everything, rose and cheerfully replied. We spent hours to establish a radio and telephone connection with the Inspector of Fighter Aviation or the headquarters of the Air Fleet. But so far without success. Here, Major. Undoubtedly we will have to fly out tomorrow at dawn for reconnaissance, probably to Cape Bune, Pantelleria, Malta and the landing grounds. He was still discussing in detail what we could and should do the next day, when I gestured for him to stop. I stood up and went to the door leading to my room. As I closed the door behind me, I saw that Bachmann and Godet had fallen asleep. 13 July 1943. I was awakened by movement in the next room. The fat man was setting the table for breakfast. Bright light was seeping through the bars of the shutters. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. I picked up the telephone receiver and turned the knob. Put me through to the command center, please. Command post here, Hauptmann Kegel. Anything new to report? How many aeroplanes can we get in the air? We still don't have any orders from the fleet or the fighter inspector. Radio communications have been impossible to establish, and we have had no telephone contact for more than a few minutes at a time. We still do not know how many airworthy aircraft we have. Our few surviving aircraft were scattered around Trapani, Sayaka airfields, and the 2 forward takeoff and landing sites. The outlook was grim, as we no longer had spare parts. We could not lift aircraft against the enemy if their radios were faulty, their brakes useless, or their armament badly synchronized. Such were the technical laws of air warfare that governed us. According to the report of the Radio Interception Service, the bomber formations were already approaching the Straits of Messina. I'll be at the command center within half an hour. Very good, Herr Major. Through the open French windows leading to the balcony, the morning sun threw a bright rectangle of light on the table and the opposite wall with a large mirror. The fat man set the table modestly. On the bare wood stood thick army-style porcelain mugs and empty plates, a knife beside each. He had obviously already packed everything else for the getaway, though he had no idea how he was going to transport it all. The bougainvillea leaves in the vase had wilted. Seeing them reminded me of our dinner the previous night. When I entered, Bushman was up. He was dressed in a freshly laundered tropical uniform, and behind his chair was a pilot's duffel bag of blue sailcloth, fitted with a pair of straps so that it could be carried behind his back. The fat man poured coffee and stayed near the table to listen to what we were talking about, afraid we might leave him here alone or even forget him. As I sipped my coffee languidly, my eyes came across Adler im Sayeden, the Air Fleet newspaper that Bachmann had brought back from Gerbini. It was the issue of the 10th of July. Its front page, crumpled and coffee-stained, was peppered with headlines about heroic defensive battles and the determination to throw the enemy back into the sea. How disgusting, I thought, that they should spread catchphrases like these when everyone knew that none of them were true. We reached the command post without meeting a soul on the way, as if knowing that their suffering was almost over and that we would have to retreat. The Sicilians holed up behind closed doors. As a consequence, absolute peace reigned in the countryside through which we were travelling, the only dissonance being the rumble of our Kübelwagen and the noise of its engine. By this time, the pilots had returned from their reconnaissance flights. They reported heavy traffic between Tunis and Pantelleria, probably supply ships. As they flew over the island, fighter planes took off. The airfield was filled with single-engine machines, Thunderbolts. The enemy felt so safe that they did not even use the stone caponiers built before by the Italians. The first group conducted a reconnaissance of the sea in the direction of Malta. According to its report, cruisers and destroyers were patrolling in the landing area. Near Gela, the smaller vessels were busily shuttling between the larger ships, some of which were anchored in a great arc around the landing beachhead, while others were moving back and forth. At the moment when I was seeking for the 100th time information as to the number of me we could get in the air, Bachmann came out of the barracks with a magazine of telegrams in his hand. "This has just come from Corleone, Herr Major," he said, and in a loud voice, loud enough for virtually everyone to hear, he began to read. "The western part of Sicily will be evacuated. All airworthy aircraft of the 77th Fighter Squadron are to fly immediately to the mainland, and personnel are to be sent along the north coast to Milazzo without delay. The Führer's order that no soldier may leave the island is still in force. Inspector of Fighter Aviation, so it was settled. Perhaps this was the result of Lutzo's modest, unseen work. In fact, it meant that the High Command conceded that the battle was lost. Strangely enough, the effect of this was not demoralizing. On the contrary, it seemed that the future again had some prospect of a new beginning, perhaps even victory. Such was the effect a clear order had on the soldiers. "What time is it?" 8:30. Nikegel relay the order to Group 1 in Shocker. They need to move faster if they're going to get to Milazzo in time. And you'd better start destroying our equipment. As if offering to close this particular chapter, marauders appeared from the north over Mount Eris. Henrich reported that he had intercepted their radio conversations, and as he spoke, anti-aircraft artillery came into action. The bombers' aiming was poor. It took their entire load to plough through the olive grove at the end of the aerodrome and rip the roofs off one or two village houses. When the anti-aircraft guns stopped firing, the men continued their work again as if nothing had happened. I wonder how far the Americans had got. The fighter inspector's telegram reached us through several relay stations, as we already had no direct communication with the eastern part of the island. We had to hurry to keep our transports from being cut off. If the Americans advanced far north to the coastal highway, it would mean the end for the squadron. I wondered what to do next, and came up with resolutely nothing better than to relax in a deck chair under an awning outside the barracks and wait for the work of destruction to be finished. Everything burned, blown up, or smashed to pieces. It was absolutely pointless to attempt any new sorties. I would watch them take off one by one to land on the mainland. Then I would be free, relieved of responsibility. For a few days I will have no communications, I will not be involved in combat, I will be out of the service and current affairs. The bombers once more wasted their cargo uselessly over the already scarred landscape, bringing to the homes of the Sicilians the fact that our last hour had come. The tall, oblong-faced, self-possessed Germans, who had behaved as if they owned the whole island with its mixed races, with its colourful, agile inhabitants as tall as pygmies in comparison. These Germans were now forced to retreat. The crunch of gravel under the wheels interrupted my musings. Personnel cars and lorries lined up on the narrow dirt airstrip and under Kegel's direction. Technicians were assembling and loading radio equipment and the most essential equipment for the cond. Skeins of electrical and telephone wires piled up near the tunnel. Entrance leading to the unfinished cave in the cliff that would become our bomb-proof shelter. Days of pneumatic hammers drilling and chiseling it were wasted. Every time there was a bombardment, we hurried through the mounds of yellow rock, rubble under the cool protection of the tunnel, and every time we found the same workers in dusty. Dark clothes huddled in a corner, hiding, like us, from the bombardment. They accepted the offered cigarette, thanked us with a slight bow, hiding it under their sweat-drenched caps. Lately they had stopped talking when we entered, but none of them had a look of triumph in their eyes at our defeat. It was more like knowing that the end had come and that we were going to retreat. Today they stood in the blazing sun on a rocky mound near the cave, watching our destructive actions intently. They had withdrawn a little when Kegel stuck a match into the mountain of paper. Telegrams and reports, correspondence with the inspector of fighter aviation, with Corps headquarters, with air staff, etc., that had piled up near the cave. Great tongues of flame shot out into the clear morning air, occasionally carrying away some important document whose charred remains landed high on the cliffside and then glided into the valley like a child's paper aeroplane. The labourers waited in absolute silence, their eyes fixed on the barracks. They left their water jugs, wrapped in damp rags in the shadow of the cliff, next to the baskets containing cheese and tomatoes. Surely they're not going to set fire to the barracks. Their faces seemed to say, "We'll be able to use every scrap of that wire." "What are we going to do with the barracks?" Kegel asked. "Nothing," I said. "Leave it to the labourers." Butchman returned from the villa, brakes squealing as he pulled up in front of the command centre. He had brought my traveller's kit with him, worn leather suitcases and a sleeping bag. He told me that Fatty had flatly refused to load aboard the lorry and drive back all the treasure he had accumulated. I found him in the garden surrounded by empty wine and brandy bottles with which he was filling a trench he had dug. He was making a stash, saying that no one knows if we'll be back again. The girl, Teresa, sat in front of the grotto with an impenetrable face, watching the feverish gathering and movement. The doors and shutters of the neighbouring buildings remained closed, as if their owners were deliberately ignoring our departure, or rather our retreat. There was silence. The sun shone mercilessly from the yellow sky. There was not a whiff of wind to stir the sticky, stuffy air. From time to time we could hear the technicians shouting orders to each other down on the aerodrome. Suddenly I saw a scene playing out along the far side of its perimeter. As if on cue, large flames rose rapidly, one after another, between the rows of olive trees. A cloud of dirty grey smoke rose above them, but it did not dissipate, but remained hanging like huge balloons. Then I heard shouts and screams. The work of destruction had begun. Several lorries stopped in front of the barracks. Their flaps fell down with a clang, and soldiers jumped onto the rough gravel. Loudly pushing each other, they began to carry skeins of wire and blocks of radio equipment. An hour or more later, I was awakened by the staff clerk. "The anti-aircraft commander wants to talk to you, Mr. Major." In front of the barracks stood Hauptmann in a tropical uniform. When I went out to him, he saluted me surly. Around his neck he wore large binoculars, and on his hip, on a sagging belt, hung a pistol in a shining black leather holster. "What the hell is going on over there, Mr. Major?" he asked. "Have you given orders regarding all this wanton destruction and arson?" "Yes, I gave such an order. But surely you can't be held responsible for what your boys are doing over there." "I am the best judge of that." I parried coldly. He was evidently hardly in control of himself. "Look, Mr. Major, my lads are in the firing positions of their guns. We have suffered heavy casualties during the past few days, and as for sleep, we can hardly remember what it is. Now they see your men piling up valuable equipment and dousing it with petrol. They see engines smashed to pieces and craters full of destroyed spare parts and tools, not to mention tents and food. This is beyond our comprehension. We must stay here and fight while you retreat." "Retreat, you say? You propose to hold western Sicily with your battery alone?" Suddenly the Hauptmann's mood changed. "I am not suggesting," he said with poise, "but if I am ordered to, what should I do?" Seeing his impeccable behaviour, despite his extreme irritation, I remembered that throughout the period of continuous bombing, 88mm anti-aircraft guns placed around the airfield performed their task perfectly. Under the scorching sun, and even at night, the gunners had to carry their heavy shells by hand, and they could not, like us, find shelter in the trenches when the bombs fell and their roaring carpet moved towards us, destroying everything in its path. "If I perfectly understand that you must be annoyed and upset," I said conciliatingly, "I did not order the destruction of food, and I will see that it is stopped immediately. If your men were not here, they would have wiped us out in a couple of days. But what is left for us to do but destroy all that we cannot take with us? I suppose you hardly want us to leave you with a few aircraft engines and a staffed workshop?" Still looking on with indignation, he shook his head. "It is going to be hard as hell to maintain discipline. All this burning and destruction will end in panic and general mass flight." "You mustn't worry," I said bitterly. "Mass flight is a good thing. The western part of Sicily will be evacuated, and no doubt you will be informed soon. But why should all this valuable material be destroyed?" "I'll tell you why. Because I want to get every man to the mainland. Because there's no room in the lorries for tools and engines and things like that. We can get a large number of engines if we manage to cross the Straits of Messina, but we can't get new mechanics, parachute riggers and radio operators." He shook his head again, looked at me angrily, and replied, "I don't understand. You leave us here alone. All right, you were ordered to do it. But before you execute it, you display unprecedented vandalism. Then you climb into your fast planes, and in an hour you'll be safe in some peaceful rear area." He was giving vent to all his latent non-flyer anger, believing that the air cavalry enjoyed incredible privileges. that they were the people who just flew away, leaving him to do the dirty work on the ground. This has been the case since the fighter pilots of World War I were actually recruited from privileged cavalry regiments. In France, they lived in castles and drank champagne when others were content with water. In 1940, we were happily following them. We, too, lived in castles, drank champagne and, breaking all rules of uniform, gave free rein to our individual taste by wearing soft fur boots and marvellous leather jackets captured from the enemy to distinguish ourselves from the military walking on the ground. The Reichsmarschall himself, a lover of sumptuous and varied costumes, noticed this weakness of ours, powerless to do anything about it. He mercilessly insulted those for whose desperate situation he was responsible. He arrogantly referred to the fighter pilots in France as squadrons of silk pyjamas. Perhaps our affectation in this regard went too far. A puffy moustache, say, or things like our yellow scarves, sandals and Freytag's white golfers, or perhaps a trophy light brown harness with a 6.35 mm revolver. Maybe the non-flyer saw us in a completely different light. Our almost limitless battlefield was at 9,000 meters in the icy air, invisible to the ordinary eye. They saw us only while we, dressed in our unformed clothes, rested on the ground between sorties. But the thought never occurred to them that our next sortie could have ended in the death of any veteran, experienced hundreds of times. Hauptmann saluted, got into the vehicle and drove off. He looked fierce and angry, down on the runway below. The first 109ths were turning out against the wind to fly to the mainland. I had to personally supervise the destruction work and make sure nothing was missed. The road leading into the city was completely empty. Beyond the entrance to the aerodrome, the bombing had rendered it completely unusable. I drove out to the track leading round the almost circular airfield, picking my way through the gardens and courtyards of ruined farms. Hangars, administration buildings, and the flight control tower lay in ruins. In front of them, the charred skeletons of burnt-out aeroplanes, a jumbled mass of useless metal. I turned off the track to the south and followed the sand-filled carriageway through several olive groves before reaching the large open area where the workshops had once stood. Already from afar I could hear the voices of people echoing around the greedy fire, a symbol of wanton destruction. A cloud of black smoke rose high above the trees, where it then fanned out like the crown of a pine tree. I stopped near a gap in the cactus hedge, got out of the car, and had hardly stepped onto the soft sand, when I was stopped by a picture that suddenly appeared before my eyes. Where the workshop tent had once stood there now burned an imposing fire. The men of my squadron were nimbly circling around it, feeding the flames with the contents of the lorries that had been unloaded and hauled from the edge of the field. The new load of fuel they threw into the fire made a high arc, and, as it landed, raised a sheaf of sparks over a large area. Meanwhile, the fire roared like a ravenous animal. There was something of an orgy in this dance round the flames. Soldiers grabbed whatever object they could hold in their hands and hurled it into the flames with shrieks. Crates, chairs, tents, cots, telephones, tools. In fact, anything that served to keep the squadron headquarters and groups in an actionable condition and to sustain them during the fighting. In one corner of the field, they were assembling a huge pile of engines and metal parts. This way, aides a little higher up. "When you're done here, we'll pour petrol on this lot," yelled a non-commissioned officer who was stepping up to the engines with a sledgehammer like a madman. They were working at a tremendous pace, for they knew that only when they had finished could they leave for Messina and thus escape capture. But if the Lightnings and Kitty Hawks discovered the convoy, this trip would surely be the last for many of these men. "Attention! Ammunition!" One of the men spun a wooden box around and sent it into the fire with all his energy. "You've gone mad," I shouted. But my voice was drowned in the noise. Suddenly bullets whistled and whirred in all directions like fireworks. Looking around, I saw that everyone around me was lying flat on their stomachs or had taken cover behind earthen ramparts. I told the officer to see to it that everything was done properly. How was all this, I asked myself, really different from what had happened 3 months earlier in Tunisia? And was it actually possible to carry out such wanton destruction in a disciplined and organized manner? The crackle of fire and the WRRP and FFT of exploding ammunition seemed to fill the soldiers with an unusual glee. It was clear that not far away, behind the next hedge of cacti, another destructive work was going on, for I could see another growing cloud of smoke. As soon as the ammunition stopped exploding, the next lorry came through the narrow gap, loaded with equipment and supplies of all kinds. Crates and boxes, hammers, pulleys, batteries, shovels, steel helmets, tires and cables were hurriedly unloaded from the truck and dragged along the ground to the fire or thrown, and they flew in a high arc straight into the fire. Everything was happening in haste and turmoil. There was no time to lose. Then I saw the spectators hiding behind the agave hedge, the inhabitants of the neighbouring farms. From time to time some figure would creep out of the cactus thickets, rush forward a metre or two, and seizing a rope, tarpaulin, or box, rush back to the shelter with its prey. I could hear the hoarse voice of Hauptmann Kegel shouting orders, noticing my presence. Almost finished, Herr Major. 2 more lorries to go. But the inhabitants are carrying things like jackdaws. His hands were covered with soot up to his elbows, and his tropical shirt was soaked with sweat. Indeed, the heat near the fire was unbearable. Ned and I start sending lorries to Milazzo that are no longer needed, of course. Start immediately. They'll be safer if they go alone. Back at the command post, I found Bachmann, Kohler, and Tarno sitting in deck chairs under an awning. The luggage they were going to take with them stood at the ready beside them. A map of Sicily and southern Italy was spread out on Bachmann's lap. On the barrack step sat Fatty in full camping gear. When he saw me, he immediately began to unwrap the rolls of bread, cheese, and ham and to arrange the contents on tin plates on a stool. Nearby stood a large radio van with its doors open, awaiting the order to leave. The fat man kept it in sight, for he was to leave with the signalman as soon as their services were no longer required. "Better get going," I said, turning to Bachmann and Kohler. "Take off now and fly to our rear base in Foges. Within 2 or 3 days we will know where we will operate from." Bachmann mumbled something inaudible. It could have been, "I would like to fly with you, Herr Major, or why aren't you flying with us?" But they both stood up, put on their rucksacks and, already burdened with them, tried to salute indifferently before wandering off to their Kugelwagen. The heavy midday hours flowed slowly. Down on the aerodrome the fires continued unabated. From time to time aeroplanes took off singly or in pairs. From early morning onwards the marauders did not appear again, as if they knew that our end was near and that we no longer represented a worthy target. The 109th flew off, and the transport started towards Milazzo. I now gave the order regarding the departure of the radio van, whereupon Fatty nimbly jumped onto the footplate of the vehicle and disappeared through the door. Kubel, with 2 slumbering mechanics inside, stood ready to take me to the aerodrome as soon as I decided it was time to start. My mission here was over. Suddenly the burden of responsibility left me. In accordance with the authorization I had received, I had destroyed the squadron, smashed it beyond recognition. Everything was against us. Shame and anger overwhelmed me, completely banishing all sense of liberation. How I hated it all. Flying fortresses and their almost arrogant contempt for our ineffective attacks, the High Command with its neglect and insults, the heat of the Sicilian summer, and the incessant sun. If I wanted to reach the mainland before sunset, it was time to head for the airfield. The shadows were getting longer, and in the afternoon sunlight, like every day in Sicily, the colours were beginning to blaze. My Me was parked directly beside the runway. Small leather suitcases and a sleeping bag were stowed in the tiny luggage compartment behind the armoured back. There was nothing holding me here now. Other pilots, as they had recently in Tunisia, carried their mechanics in the fuselage. They called themselves the unfortunate servants of Lufthansa. On my Me 109, the space was filled with combat logs and officers' reports. Bachmann barely had time to snatch the ammunition box containing these documents from the man who was about to send it into the fire. Something seemed to hold me back, however, as if the mission that had been assigned to us, and which we had failed, was still incomplete. The silence was broken by the popping of ammunition exploding in the fires on the aerodrome. Behind the nearest hedge, between the olive trees, the barrels of 88mm anti-aircraft guns peered vigilantly into the sky, as if there was something else here that needed defense. The telephones had been dismantled or destroyed. Fieldfell Henrich and his radio interception unit had long since left their fabled place in the tower of the ancient castle and were now on their way to Milazzo. The workers commandeered the former command centre. Looking in the direction of Eris, I saw that the barrack was in the process of being dismantled. First the roof disappeared, then the side walls, then the end walls. The mechanics in the Kubel wagon looked at me askance, as if asking themselves, when the hell is it going to take off? I went to me and slowly, one by one, began the preparations. Life jacket. Run a belt between my legs and buckle it. A belt with flares on the calves of my legs. Fold up the map so the route could be seen. The mechanics silently climbed up onto the wing of the Me and opened the cockpit lantern. As the parachute strap snapped into the lock on my chest, the whining sound of the inertial starter began to rise, to grow louder. Everything was happening according to plan. The last takeoff from Sicily was to be no different from any other. The engine was running smoothly. According to a system you won't find anywhere in manuals, my eyes travelled along the dashboard. At the same time, I looked left and right at equal intervals and surveyed the airspace behind and above me. A pilot flying alone must be doubly cautious. The familiar smells came again: oil, coolant, grease, and petrol. The peculiar Messerschmitt aroma that came from the hot engine, from the hot oil in the oil pipes and the glycol in the cooling. Every aircraft has its own odour. Workers near the cave on Mount Eris looked up as I was performing a turn in my Me flying around the rock. For a few seconds I saw our villa, and then there was only the sea in front of me. I made a long detour northwards to circle the Bay of Palermo. A mist hung over the town, from which Mount Pellegrino rose, reflecting the evening light. The sun was directly behind me. At an altitude of 4,000 meters, I gently moved back the throttle lever and leveled the surface of the engine bonnet against the dark edge of the horizon. As the mountains dropped steeply into the sea, I could see between the tip of the right plane and the spinning propeller the pale ribbon of the coastal motorway. High in the sky soared the snow-covered peak of Etna, easily visible through the triangular side window next to the thick bluish armor glass in front of the scope. Along this coastal highway between Palermo and Messina moved my squadron, or rather the human component of my squadron. Tiny batches of men had been sent in separate small convoys with orders to gather together wherever they could. How they would cross the strait was still unclear. It was thought it might be done by the Seabill ferries and pontoons travelling there, but the Allies were making murderous raids on the Straits of Messina. Accordingly, there was a high concentration of heavy anti-aircraft artillery in that area. In my headphones there was little or none of the noise that usually accompanies air combat. Now, just before sunset, all was quiet, only rustling and crackling. Then, for a few seconds, the loud roar of transmitters being switched on and off, followed by complete silence. When I arrived in Trapani in the spring, early April, the slopes were bright green and the mountain tops were shrouded in rain clouds. I was on my way to Africa then, and like today, I was flying alone. The final stage of the war in Tunisia had begun, and the Allies were pushing north across the Maret line. And today I was flying to the mainland. The last of my squadron, and the evacuation of the island had begun. The mountainsides were bare and scorched by the summer sun, and it had only been 3 months since that first flight. The extent to which Fortress Europe had shrunk was frightening. Very low to my right lay the city of Cefalù. I decided to fly north over the Lipari Islands to avoid the Strait of Messina. Even if the fighters and flying fortresses were on their way home by this time of day, I might attract the attention of my own anti-aircraft artillery, and I had no desire to do so. The tops of the mountains were a deep blue colour, and above them the summit of Etna blazed like a torch. I kept my course for the southern extremity of Calabria, between the Strait and Stromboli, over which hung a black cloud. Strait of Messina, a brilliant strip of water fringed by blue hills, reflected the evening sunlight. The silhouette of my wing, travelling slowly over the glistening water, formed for a moment a link between the island and the mainland. It was then that I saw innumerable small dark patches dotting the sky above the strait in the shape of a splendidly regular dome. The heavy anti-aircraft artillery was vigorously putting up a barrage against the flying fortresses. The round grassy expanse of the Vibo Valentia aerodrome was visible from afar. It was the only flat spot among the olive groves and heavily overgrown slopes of the mountain range that slopped down right into the toe of Italy. I brought my Me at minimum speed up to the landing signal strip that indicated where the aerodrome ended and the slope began. Just before I landed, the tops of tall poplars flashed on either side of my wingtips. Although the aerodrome was frequently bombed, it was little damaged compared to our landing sites in Sicily. Nevertheless, the hangars on the east side of the road to Reggio lay in ruins. Bomb blasts had ripped out gates and blown roofs to shreds. Although many of the craters had been filled and levelled, my plane bounced on landing, and before it came to a stop, I had to work the rudder pedals vigorously to keep it from scapotting. Only a few minutes later, Oberst Lotzo's vehicle stopped near me. As the officer in charge of fighter control here, he was to brief me on the future operations of my squadron. We sat on the grass near my aircraft, and Lotzo briefly described the situation in Sicily. It was easy to realize that the end was near. The decision to evacuate the island completely had now been taken, and in spite of the tremendous efforts made by the Allies, the withdrawal seemed to be taking place in an organized manner. Continuous bombing strikes were launched in an attempt to stop the ferry service between the island and the mainland, but anti-aircraft artillery put up massive barrages, forcing the bombers to perform anti-aircraft maneuvers and throwing off their aim. Field Marshal gave orders that I was to assemble a squadron on the mainland and prepare for air defence of Calabria and Apulia. In doing so, however, we were to avoid large airfields which were known to the enemy. Possible alternatives were tracts of arable land near Crotone, the Calabrian coast near Catanzaro, or the relatively treeless plain of Basilicata. The choice of advanced airstrips was left to me. Good, I thought. New orders, new duties, new hopes. But today I was alone, without a squadron and without responsibility. I could think of myself. However, I did not want to stay where I was. Lotso agree. Martine, go to Apulia, but make haste to find where to land before dusk. Even before I started to make a wide circle over the city and the port of Taranto, I saw the white beach of Basilicata gliding beneath my wing and seemingly endless. The white surf phosphoresced in the blue dusk. The airfield in Manduria was a long and narrow strip of land between vineyards and olive groves. The lights were already burning in the nearby houses when I landed on the springy turf. While waiting for the car, I stood with the German Hauptmann in front of a tent that combined the functions of a flight control center and an administrative building. "It's quiet enough here," he remarked. "Occasionally we see four-engined bombers flying over, but they haven't dropped anything on us yet. The British attacked Gelsenkirchen a night ago. The city is still on fire and there are heavy civilian casualties. My family lives in Gelsenkirchen." And since I didn't answer anything, he continued. "A few minutes ago we were listening to a radio program from home and learnt that they raided Danzig last night. Just think of it, Mr. Major. Danzig." Darkness fell quickly. I breathed in the scent of the pine and eucalyptus trees that grew behind the tent, and listened with pleasure to the noisy chorus of crickets. The sky was dark purple, and the trees stood out against it like paper profiles. Although the words Gelsenkirchen and Danzig were still ringing in my ears, I could not help the sudden feeling of happiness that had taken possession of me. I decided to go into town to spend the night in a clean, quiet hotel room. The Topolino was to take me to Lexi. I was still left to myself. No one would be looking for me to ask me what my orders and dispositions for the day would be. Although I was exhausted, I wanted to eat and drink a bottle in the restaurant, looking at the other visitors living a carefree life here as if it was a time of peace. Topolino arrived, bouncing in the grass, and stopped beside me. "Hey, I would like to be picked up at 8 in the morning. I'll be flying out to Foggia. Please see to it that my car is fueled." "Yes, Mr. Major. Good night." The road to town was busy with traffic. The fertile vineyards it passed through went all the way to the outskirts of the city. In the suburbs, people sat outside their homes, enjoying the evening chill. Soldiers and their girls jumped to the side of the road when they heard our approaching car. The Hotel Grand Italia was located in the Piazza Sant'Oronzo. Architecturally, it harmonized with the rest of the city and was one of those large stone palazzi called Grandi Hotel, Hotel Roma or Albergo Napoli, that one finds in any decent city. The doorman took my modest luggage to the ground floor, where I was given a room with a window and balcony overlooking the piazza. The curtains were drawn because of light cloaking, placing my suitcases and sleeping bag on the nightstand beside the bed. I switched off the light and, pulling back the curtains, looked out of the window. The square was bathed in the twilight of a summer night. The large, baroque facades of the buildings around it seemed to blaze, as if they had absorbed the day's sunlight. They were the colour of pink marshmallows. I lay on the bed facing the window, so I could see the starry sky. Fatigue was pressing down on me. If I closed my eyes for a few seconds, I would fall asleep quickly. But I wanted to make the most of the evening. I wanted to really feel that I was alive, that I would be alive the next day, and that I had a right to live. I wanted to sit at a set table with wine glasses, napkins and cutlery, and I wanted to eat delicious food, to spoon cheese onto pasta. I wanted to feel in my hand the dark bottle of red wine with its brightly coloured label and emblem printed on the glass. I wanted to do it slowly and leisurely, with pleasure, and there had to be people around me. In my mind, they were the lively people of Puglia, who in a peculiar way wanted to ignore the circumstances of the war and the fact that a little more than 100 kilometres away from them a lost battle was nearing its end. I pictured them arguing excitedly and putting forward their theories, thus communicating that in their opinion it was time to end the whole affair. Unfortunately, my appearance was far from perfect. Fatty had managed to wash my shirt at the last moment, but my trousers were stained and wrinkled, but hardly anyone would have noticed. I stood up and walked down the wide staircase and entered the small restaurant. The tables outside under the arcades were lighted enough for customers to eat at. No one in Lecce cared excessively about light disguise. Tables covered with red and white tablecloths were surrounded by blooming oleanders. The arcades were filled chiefly with soldiers, but there were also a few natives, whose lively conversation, interspersed with merry exclamations and feminine laughter, filled the small square with the pleasant sounds of their melodious language. I ordered pasta asciuttata, a delightful smoked ham and melon, accompanied by a strong red salis. The bread was snowy white, with a crispy crust. Inside the restaurant, there was a bar along the length of one of the walls. The wall itself consisted of large panes of glass, equipped with shelves on which stood many bottles with brightly coloured labels. Seated at my table were an Italian parachute captain and his girlfriend. He flaunted a small, bushy moustache, and, even after sitting down at the table, remained in his red beret, which he wore carelessly pulled over one eyebrow. The captain gesticulated constantly as he spoke, trying to emphasize his words, and he could not stop. Where had the others landed? Perhaps at the aerodrome in Bari, where almost all aircraft sent from the Reich to replenish our squadron arrived. Or perhaps at Foggia, where we had a small camp to concentrate personnel and equipment. Alternatively, they could have landed at Brindisi, Gioia del Colle Lili Taranto. Buxman, I knew, would stay in some luxury hotel in Foggia and eat in one of the many restaurants which, as in peacetime, had culinary delicacies to suit all tastes. Foggia was still deep behind the lines, but for how long? Rayonert was probably in Bari to continue language lessons with his girlfriend. I wondered if they could actually meet. Taxi drivers there had a habit of asking, with a wink, Setentasinkai, if their passenger was German. 75 was the number of the house where the girls of easy behaviour lived. I was firmly convinced that there would be raucous parties there tonight. If British night bombers were now reaching Danzig, the Americans would not rest until they sent their huge armadas there during the day. The Reichsmarschall will again become enraged and lay the blame on the fighters. The hapless survivors will wander among the smoking mountains of rubble in search of their children and relatives. Then, heart-sick and exhausted, they will warily return to the endless routine of their factories and offices. The fighting on the plain west of Catania must by now have reached Gabini. A parachute landing was to be thrown out this evening to delay the Allied advance and allow as many men as possible to cross the Straits of Messina. We wouldn't find peace at Foggia either. Heavy bombers would launch attacks on the mainland as soon as Sicily fell. Nothing remained of the strange attraction that had almost obsessively drawn us to air combat, first over the Channel and then in Russia. The chivalrous behaviour associated with aerial duelling, the willingness to accept a challenge again and again, has given way to a sense of vulnerability, and the pleasure we once derived from combat, as from a sporting duel with an equal opponent, has faded into the distant past. Frustration and exasperation grow in a man with virtually no chance of survival, and he is not inclined to fiddle with words. But our sarcasm took forms incomprehensible to those who were not so vulnerable. By distinguishing themselves as something more than instruments of destruction, the fighters had become proud, almost arrogant, in a way that could only be equalled by other pilots, except for paratroopers or submariners. They now rarely remembered the final victory and the days that followed it. They were also disgusted by the pathos of newspaper articles about the front. The pompousness of journalistic propaganda provoked annihilating comments. They no longer believed in anything at all. Is this a budding defeatism? I asked myself. Suddenly we heard the noise of bomber engines overhead. Instantly the conversations around the tables stopped, but as soon as the noise died down in the distance, the small square was once again filled with the sound of voices. The red wine was strong and slightly tipsy. I got up and left the restaurant to go upstairs to my room. From the mirror an unfamiliar face stared back at me, yellow and elongated. When I switched off the light, the darkness seemed so dense that I felt a kind of fear. But the linen sheets were charmingly cool and smelled pleasantly of soap. Gradually a feeling of absolute security came over me. Early in the morning I was to fly to Bari to find out whether the new machines from the factories had arrived there in sufficient numbers. At Foggia, Bachmann was to make the necessary preparations for our search for an aerodrome. We were in dire need of a new Pfizer Storch. I myself did not like the huge yellow wheat fields near Crotone, as they were in an area where malaria was spreading. Also, the heat there was unbearably hot, and the dust rising on takeoff would give away our location. In the wooded, mountainous Sila area, east of Cosenza, which was at an altitude of over 1,000 meters, there were supposedly large stretches of uncultivated land in pastures that we could turn into forward takeoff and landing sites. The woods would provide good camouflage for our me. I hoped that there would be a sufficient number of gunboats among the planes at Bari, a modification which, in addition to the 20 mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, had 2 more mounted in containers under the planes. It was fortunate that the squadron still had a few vehicles at Foggia's. We could go to the depots and get tents, tools and lifting gear, new engines, 1,001 things to replace what had been destroyed only this morning. Again, we would not be given any time to recover, except for a couple of days in Foggia to sleep and bathe in Manfredonia Bay. We were to practice our attacks on the fortresses. Approaching on a countercourse, we had to stay close together, wing to wing, until the silhouette of the bomber was exactly in our sights.